When you picture a Viking raid, you're probably imagining horned helmets, berserkers in a drug-fueled frenzy, ships appearing randomly, attacking anything they see. Almost none of that happened. Real Viking raids were calculated business operations executed by warriors who'd spent years mapping their targets. They knew exactly where you kept your silver. They knew when your guards would be distracted, and they knew you'd never see them coming. Hollywood has sold us a very specific image of Vikings. Wild-eyed warriors in ridiculous horned helmets, screaming as they charge randomly at whatever settlement they stumble upon. It's chaos, it's mindless violence, it's berserkers gone mad. You've seen it in every Viking movie and TV show, and it makes for great drama. Vikings as unstoppable forces of nature, conquering through sheer ferocity. But here's what the archaeological evidence actually shows. Vikings weren't random raiders stumbling upon targets. They were reconnaissance experts who'd often traded with their victims for years before attacking them. Isotope analysis of bones from Bambur near Lindisfarne, the site of the first major raid, suggests Vikings knew this landscape, this seascape, the social world long before they attacked. They'd been watching, learning, planning. Because here's what movies can't show you. A typical Viking raid was a masterclass in asymmetric warfare. Vikings didn't just sail until they found something worth stealing. They spent years mapping targets through trade networks. They cataloged monastery treasures. They noted coastal defenses. They monitored political instability in kingdoms they planned to hit. When 3 ships beached at Lindisfarne on June 8, 793 AD, it wasn't a random attack. They knew exactly what was there. The approach exploited every advantage. Longships with drafts of just 1 meter could navigate rivers thought impassable. They'd appear hundreds of kilometers inland before anyone knew they were coming. Warriors would lower their masts to avoid detection, row silently through darkness, time attacks for dawn, or during church festivals when crowds gathered and guards relaxed. At Lindisfarne, it was inconceivable that ships could suddenly appear from over the horizon. The monks never considered that anyone would dare attack such a holy site. The element of surprise was total. Early raids typically involved 3 to 7 ships carrying 100 to 200 warriors, enough to overwhelm any monastery, but small enough for rapid escape. The Lindisfarne raid likely lasted only hours. They hit priority targets in order: silver and gold first, captives for slavery second, religious treasures third, livestock for provisions last, and then they vanished. When Charlemagne mobilized troops immediately upon hearing of a raid on Frisia, he arrived to find empty beaches. The Vikings were already gone. But this is where things get psychological. Vikings understood something crucial. Fear multiplies effectiveness. The dragon-headed prows on their ships weren't decoration. They were psychological weapons. English chroniclers called these vessels dragon ships, and their appearance on the horizon meant devastation was minutes away. Before the Lindisfarne raid, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle recorded people seeing fiery dragons flying in the air. The mere possibility of a raid induced paranoia. Vikings deliberately weaponized this terror. Berserkers, elite warriors who fought in trance-like fury, were real. The 9th century poet Thorbjorn Hornklofi wrote, "Wolf-skinned they are called. In battle they bear bloody shields. Red with blood are their spears when they come to fight." Were they drugged? The popular theory about fly agaric mushrooms doesn't match the symptoms. A more credible candidate is henbane, whose seeds were found in a Viking grave in Denmark. Its effects: pain suppression, inability to recognize faces, better match accounts of berserkers attacking friend and foe indiscriminately. But here's the thing, we don't actually know. What we do know is that berserker behavior was outlawed in Iceland in 1015 and Norway in the 11th century, suggesting it was real enough to require legal prohibition. And the effect on victims was devastating. The scholar Alcuin, writing from Charlemagne's court after Lindisfarne, captured the psychological trauma. Never before has such terror appeared in Britain, nor was it thought that such an inroad from the sea could be made. If divine protection couldn't save England's holiest site, nowhere was safe. This part is almost never shown. June 8, 793 AD, Lindisfarne Monastery. According to Simeon of Durham's account, the raiders spread on all sides like fearful wolves. They killed some monks outright, took others in iron fetters for slavery, drove many out naked, loaded with insults, drowned some in the sea. They dug up altars, seized all treasures, slaughtered livestock. This wasn't mindless violence. This was systematic looting by professionals who knew exactly what they were looking for. Lindisfarne housed St. Cuthbert's relics and 150 years of accumulated donations from nobles seeking salvation. golden crucifixes, silver chalices, bejeweled reliquaries, fine silks. The famous Lindisfarne Gospels survived, either hidden by monks or overlooked by raiders more interested in precious metals than manuscripts. Why target monasteries? Vikings weren't randomly violent, they were economically rational. Monasteries offered maximum reward with minimum risk, vast accumulated treasures, educated captives worth high ransoms, coastal locations accessible by ship, and pacifist inhabitants with no military training. Monasteries functioned as medieval banks where nobles deposited valuables for the repose of their souls. Vikings planned attacks based on information gathered from traveling merchants. But the captives were equally valuable. And this is where it gets dark. Dublin became the biggest slave market in Western Europe by the 11th century. Educated monks commanded premium prices. Women were specifically targeted because they produced high-value goods like textiles in Scandinavian society. Here's the DNA evidence. 2/3 of Iceland's female founding population had Gaelic origins, Irish or Scottish, but only 1/3 of males did. This wasn't migration. This was mass capture of women. A female slave cost a cow and an ox. Trade routes stretched from Dublin through Hedeby to Constantinople and Baghdad. Arabic dirhams flowed back in such quantities that massive hoards are still discovered across Scandinavia. The slave trade may have been the primary motivation for many raids, not treasure. And the conditions for captives. The Arab traveler Ibn Fadlan witnessed Rus Vikings on the Volga. They sail their ships to ravage As-Sakalaba and bring back captives whom they sell. Iron shackles have been excavated at Hedeby. High-ranking clergy were ransomed. Abbot Louis of St. Denis cost 686 pounds of gold plus 3,250 pounds of silver in 858. Common people were sold into slavery. But here's what surprises people. Forget the horned helmets. That's completely invented. The horned helmet myth came from Carl Emil Doppler's 1876 costume designs for Wagner's Ring Cycle operas. The helmets people cite as proof date to 900 BCE, nearly 1,500 years before the Viking Age. The only complete Viking helmet ever found is the Geirmundbu helmet. Simple iron dome with a nose guard, no horns. And forget the chainmail-clad warriors. Armor was incredibly rare. A 10th century German receipt priced chainmail at 820 silver coins. A cow cost 100. Most raiders fought in ordinary wool and leather clothing with shields as their only protection. The Geirmundbu burial is the only Viking Age grave in Scandinavia containing both helmet and chainmail. That's how rare it was. What about weapons? The spear, not the sword, was the Vikings' primary weapon. Spears appear in more burial sites than any other weapon. They required the least iron, could be made by common blacksmiths, and were devastatingly effective in shield wall formations. Swords were expensive status symbols. One saga valued a sword at 16 milk cows. Most were imported from the Frankish Rhineland. And here's something that might surprise you even more. Vikings bathed weekly. Anglo-Saxons washed twice yearly. Grooming tools, combs, tweezers, ear cleaners, are the most common finds in Viking graves. Alcuin actually criticized Northumbrians before Lindisfarne for trimming of beard and hair to resemble pagans. There was significant cultural contact before the raids. Vikings weren't unknown savages emerging from the mist. They were traders who'd visited these coasts for years. Viking wasn't an ethnicity, it was a job description. Most Scandinavians were farmers. A 2020 DNA study found that many Vikings had brown hair, not blonde, and that Viking identity was cultural, not genetic. Pictish people in Scotland became Vikings without genetic mixing. Anyone could be a Viking. It was something you did during the summer raiding season between planting and harvest. But the warfare evolved. Early raids in the 780s to 830s involved 1 to 2 ships with about 30 men. Quick summer strikes. By the 840s, fleets of 60-plus ships appeared. In 850, Vikings began overwintering in hostile territories, building fortified camps. Then came the Great Heathen Army in 865 AD. This wasn't a raid. This was an invasion. A coalition of Danish, Norwegian, Swedish, and Irish-based warriors landed in East Anglia to conquer. Archaeological evidence from their winter camp at Torksey in 872 to 873 reveals a 55-hectare settlement the size of a small town, housing several thousand individuals, including women, children, craft workers, and merchants. As one archaeologist described it, almost like a town on the move. Their camp at Repton in 873 to 874 yielded even more dramatic evidence. A mass grave containing at least 264 individuals, 80% male, mostly aged 17 to 45, many showing weapon trauma. One warrior buried with sword, axe, and Thor's hammer pendant had been stabbed more or less in the eyes with a massive cut to his femur. A boar's tusk placed between his thighs possibly replaced severed genitalia. This wasn't raiding, this was warfare. By 876 to 880, Vikings were sharing out land in Northumbria, Mercia, and East Anglia, establishing the Danelaw. By 1086, nearly half of Yorkshire place names were Scandinavian. But here's what's most misunderstood. The blood eagle, where a victim's ribs are cut from the spine and folded back like wings, is one of the most famous Viking tortures. It probably never happened. Scholar Roberta Frank examined all references in 1984 and concluded the description is more a matter of creative interpretation than a historically accurate account. A 2022 anatomical study found it was difficult but far from impossible to perform, but the victim would die so quickly that any wing shaping would occur on a corpse. Only 9 medieval accounts mention it, all written centuries after the events. No archaeological evidence of distinctive rib and spine damage exists. The legend likely grew from skaldic kennings, poetic metaphors where blood eagle may have simply meant violent death. Victorian scholars, fascinated by Viking brutality, amplified these accounts. Vikings were certainly violent. During the 845 siege of Paris, they hanged 111 Frankish prisoners on an island as a sacrifice to Odin to incite terror in the remaining forces. But Vikings often preferred extortion to fighting. Charles the Fat paid 1,094 kilograms of gold and silver to end a siege in 882. If a town was well defended, Vikings traded rather than attacked. This brings us to a surprising truth. Monasteries weren't just destroyed and abandoned. Many rebuilt and continued. Iona was raided at least 4 times between 795 and 825, yet religious life continued. Excavations at Liminge Monastery show monks returned after an 804 raid and continued living and building for several decades. As one archaeologist concluded, the monasteries had more resilience than we might expect. Alfred the Great revolutionized English defense with his Burr system, a network of 30-plus fortified towns ensuring no settlement was more than 20 miles from protection. This made sustained Viking siege warfare impossible. The Franks fortified rivers with bridges and towers. Irish built round towers 30 meters high with entrances several meters above ground. Some communities hired Vikings to defend against other Vikings. Communities adapted. They learned. They survived. So the next time you see a movie showing horned helmet berserkers randomly attacking villages, remember this. Real Viking raids were reconnaissance operations executed by traders turned warriors who knew their targets intimately. They appeared at dawn in ships that could navigate rivers thought impassable. They struck with calculated precision, prioritizing captives and silver. They weaponized terror deliberately. Dragon-proud ships, berserker screams, public executions, all designed to make resistance seem futile. Most wore simple clothing with shields. They fought with spears, not swords. They bathed more than their victims. And their greatest weapon wasn't violence. It was the fear that they could appear anywhere, at any time, and vanish before anyone could respond. That psychological warfare, not the horned helmets, is what made them terrifying. That calculated intelligence-driven brutality is what conquered kingdoms. And that's what a Viking raid really looked like.